This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming so promptly, 9:30, we have our first session on education and cultural relations this morning, and we have three speakers. And first of all, delighted to welcome Diana Gonçalves Vidal from São Paulo, who has got a very eminent record of research, particularly into this subject of education, and really looking forward to hearing about it. I suppose a lot of us will know a bit about the more modern scene of education, but I hadn't realised that there might be something interesting to hear about connections in earlier times. So I'm absolutely fascinated to hear what you have to say, Diana. So over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to thank the Institute, and particularly Linda Nilsson and Olga, for giving me the support to attend this seminar. The story I will tell you today regards a project I started last year, founded by FAPESP. It's a development of the research I began in my PhD about new education in Brazil. Even though I've been working on this subject since 1990, it was only last year when I first heard about the New Education Fellowship. So I'll start by explaining what NEF is, and follow by presenting the questions that this discovery raised. Later on, I'll tell you some of my first achievements. I'm going to read, just to be sure I'll be in the time. The New Education Fellowship, NEF, emerged as a fraternity created by Beatrice Ensor in London in 1915, with the aim of gathering together people who share the belief that the problems which threaten the civilization could only be solved by a new education conceived to prepare men and women to a world in permanent change. In 1920, the fraternity published the first volume of what would become the journal New Era, at that time called Education for the New Era, and in 1921 organized its first conference in Calais, France. Convening important educators related to the new education movement, as Ovid de Crowley, Adolphe Ferrier, Elisabeth Rotten, the conference not only gave birth to NEF, but also boosted two new journals, Pour Elle Nouvelle and Das Wanderzeitalter. I think that's it. Edited by Ferrier and Rotten, respectively. NEF emerged after the end of the World War I and expressed the desire of many educators at that time that through education it was possible to build an international community, peaceful and sympathetic, avoiding the risk of a second armed conflict of global dimensions. It was not true. With this expectation, they involved themselves in the diffusion of schooling and in debate of learning methods related to new education. Brazil was not disconnected from this movement. On the contrary, this period was called by Jorge Nagli as pedagogical optimism, and was shaped by the belief in the power of school education to overcome national problems. At that period, education reforms emerged in different Brazilian states and cities, expressing the attachment to the purpose and practice of new education. Two expressions, new school and escola novismo, became usual among educators in Brazil, beginning a long trajectory that remains still nowadays, giving support to political, editorial, and education initiatives. During the first 15 years of NEF, according to Berrani, besides Calais, six other conferences were organized. The vitality of NEF during these first years can be measured also by the increasing number of sections and journals associated to it. In 1936, there was 52 sections and groups and 22 journals in 15 languages. The defense of equality in opportunity to access and permanence of children in school The active learning based on comprehension, creativity, and sociability, uniting school, community, and youth organization, the discipline based on the respect of needs and interests of children, and the conception of a teacher training program free from pressures of policies were the main principles supported by NEF. These principles appear in the conferences and were systematically subject of articles published on the New Era. The New Era used to dedicate some volumes to one particular theme. For instance, in January 24, the articles were about sexual education in school and at home. 1924, sexual education in school and at home. Just to be sure you understood that. In January 26, the main question was recreating the teacher, and in July 29, changing the discipline at home and in school. The journal could also choose a country to tell its experiences. It was the case of January 28, entitled Pioneer Education in Russia. It's worth to expand this mention to the Russian education because it allows us to highlight some important points to the research. Initially, selecting a country so far geographically from the head bureau of NEF, always in London, calls the attention. Second, Russia has a very different language and even a different alphabet. These choices imply that neither the language nor the distance were barriers to NEF's internationalization. The argument eludes the assumption that these questions would be relevant to understand the late admission of Brazil as a NEF member. However, only in relation to the language is necessary to clarify that Portugal never had a section. Russia was of particular interest to these educators because new education was a state policy there. In comparison to other nations where new education was restrained to individual schools, Russia presented a differential. As a matter of fact, the New Era made an effort to list names and addresses of schools in the world that practiced the new methods to follow the diffusion of the movement. If in 1928 Russia was the only case, 2 years later Brazil could be considered the second country where new education became a state policy. It should have had attracted NEF's attention. Even though in South America, Argentina, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay had united themselves to NEF by 1930s, Brazil would hold a section only in 1942. In that occasion, Charlton Washburn, NEF's president, visiting South America, stayed a few days in Brazil and got in touch with Lourenço Filho, at that moment member of the staff of the Ministry of Education and Health. Mrs. Nina Celina was indicated to be the secretary of the section. She was mentioned for the first time in a report from NEF head office in 1943, simultaneously as Minister of Education and Health, a National Institute of Pedagogical Studies employee. Her name remained as a reference until 1948. After that, no other mention to Brazil educators or Brazilian section was found on the reports. Apparently, the creation of Brazilian section had no great impact. On the report, we cannot find information about initiatives related to new education fellowship in Brazil. Possibly the international context of war and the Brazilian context of authoritarian government had been the reason to this silence. The New Era made no reference to Brazil or Brazilian education at the time. The only mention located until now regards to a study about punishment in the world. In the article, Corporal Punishment, Some Reflections upon Corporal Punishment by Susan Isaacs, published in July 1929, the author claims that punishment in Brazil was illegal. The mention, however, occurred before the creation of Brazilian section, and therefore is not a consequence of it. Anyway, it indicates the contact between NEF and Brazilian educators. in the 1920s. The remissions to the Brazilian section ceased when NEF began to decline. The reports evidence that the number of national sections and initiatives decreased. In South America, only the section of Colombia and Ecuador remained active. In fact, NEF had a key role from 1920 to 1940, contributing to the creation of the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in 1946. Not only members of NEF were representatives of their countries in the first UNESCO conference in Paris, but NEF's office were used as regional support to UNESCO actions. According to authors, in the post-war World War I context, NEF enlarged its interests and embraced a large range of objectives that challenged the capacity of the agency's support, such as Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations. At that same time, the dispersion made conference less efficient, diminishing NEF's political influence. In 1966, NEF was replaced by World Education Fellowship. The new name gave substance to a change in the orientation of the fellowship that had been happening in the past decades. The shift in the sections can be one of the reasons that explain the closure of Brazilian section in 1948. For sure, educators such as Anísio Teixeira, Lourenço Filho, and Fernando Azevedo, not to mention other important names of new education movement in Brazil, were in contact with individuals that actively participated in NEF. Nevertheless, and this is the most challenging question, there are a few studies in Brazil that refer to NEF. Why the fellowship is so neglected by Brazilian historians of education? We will return to this interrogation later. This research relies on the perspective of a transnational history, which implies a refuse to the geographical national frontiers as a principle that organizes the exchanges among educators in different parts of the world. Despite the fact that NEF was constituted of national sections and groups, the web it built configured a new territoriality, simultaneously spatial and epistemological, to be explored by the investigation. In the first case, we are addressing to the constantly reconfigured comprehensiveness of the net created by NEF, mobilizing individuals and groups. At the end of 1920, for example, NEF congregated educators of 14 countries and articulated 8 educational journals. In 1936, there were 52 national sections and groups and 22 journals. In the second case, we refer to what represented the new education to these individuals and groups in terms of addressing themes, authors, and experience. It is the conjunction of these two territorialities that Transnational acquires substance. More than an international movement, it produces a new community of meaning that must be understood based on the categories by it forged. According to the TN, the task of comparative history is to proceed a logical disassembly that allows to isolate the micro configurations with the aim of identify differences more and more refined, and analyze the mechanisms of thought arranged in channels not necessarily thematic. Therefore, its commitment is to put into perspective the values and choices of a society or group, keeping a critical regard on traditions and searching to understand different cultures from their own systems of representation. Taken strictly, the spatial configuration of NEF would include Brazilian educators only for the brief period from 1942 to 1948, when Nina Celina was a member of the fellowship and Brazilian society was led by Lourenço Filho. The procedure, therefore, would restrain the analysis to locate the vestiges of a direct relation between Brazil and NEF. Beyond this dimension, the investigation in progress seeks to operate with an epistemological territoriality built upon the representation of NAF, or New Education, forged by NAF in its journals and conferences. Albeit we may not consider this territoriality as homogeneous and theoretically coherent, it produced as an effect an international mobilization of educators and institutions around consensual themes such as education for peace, education for democracy, education experience, among others, privileging authors and publications. The question becomes more instigating when we follow Watra's argumentation. According to the author, NEF's birth is coincident with the creation of departments of education in many universities around the world. Therefore, the configuration of an academic field was also subject of dispute, and those who were entangled in the debate of new education assumed posts in the academic sphere. The affirmation is also valid to the Brazilian contest. In 1934, in São Paulo, in 1935, in Rio de Janeiro, institutes of education were created and their teachers' college associated to the University of São Paulo and Distrito Federal, by the guidance of Fernando Azevedo, Anísio Teixeira, and Lourenço Filho. In 1937, the National Institute of Educational Research, INEP, was founded, representing one more step in the direction of a Brazilian educational science based on the active school. That's a photograph of one of the representations of an active school or a new education. That's in UK, Gary McCulloch analyzed the association of the Institute of Education, IOE, in London with the University of London in 1930 as a center for the study of education. In the US, the International Institute of Teachers College at the University of Columbia was created in 1923 with the financial backing of Rockefeller Foundation. The coincidences explored previously and the relationship between Brazilian and foreign educators identified gave support to the core problem of the research, swinging from connection to disconnection. Methodologically, we move on the porosity of the interstices, valuing contacts and absences. Regarding the contacts, the purpose is to detect appropriations and treat them not as distortions of the original, but as recreations of meaning, combining cultural semantics to procedure a new originality. Regarding the absences, they are considered as part of what constitutes the territoriality. This procedure is called discomparison because it searches for empty spaces instead of locating recurrences. When faced with the challenge to connect new education in Brazil with the international movement in 1920 and 1930, researchers very often mention the Ligue Internationale pour l'Éducation Nouvelle, LIAN. In order to assure this relationship, they cite Adolphe Ferrier travel to Latin America and the news about Brazilian educational reforms published on Pour Elle Nouvelle. Albeit Ferrier never really visited Brazil. Once he arrived at Rio de Janeiro when the revolution of 1930 erupted, he got information about new education movement in Brazil. According to Marta Carvalho, Ferrier received written material to read in the ship during his trip back home, sent by Brazilian educators. These tests were published afterwards on Pour Elle Nouvelle. The mention to Ferrier and to Pour Elle Nouvelle caused attention, initially because we know that the journal was created during the first conference organized by NAF in Calais in 1921 as part of this new net. Secondly, because according to Joseph Cucuz, Ferrier had been charged to disseminate the LIAN among Latin American countries, while Beatriz Ensor would take care of Anglophonic countries and Elizabeth Rotten the Germanophonic ones. The reference to Beatrice Ensor and Elizabeth Houghton drives us to the founders of NEF. When Marta Carvalho explained the birth of Lyon, she retells the history of NEF creation. The authors led us to the obvious deduction that in the geographical and epistemological Brazilian territory, NEF was always referred as Lyon. The procedure helped to erase the connection between international movement and its head office in London, as well as to the IOE. It associated this international movement to the Francophonic context and the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute, nest of Pour Elle Nouvelle, workplace of Ferrier, and institution visited by Brazilian educations at the time in search for interchange. According to Cucuz, Ferrier complained about the lack of attendance of Latin American educators to the Conference of Locarno and Elsinore. This fact may have collaborated to the disconnection New Education International movement from NEF. We would also argue that Brazil educators were more familiar to French than English. However, I think it's a minor concern, and we can discard this explication easily. I do not intend to revival the argumentation about Russia, rose briefly, but bring new elements that are relevant to the understanding of the problematic. It's necessary to emphasize that in 1920s, a long cycle of trips to US were made by Brazilian educators. They were interested in knowing the educational system and improving their training. Many of them, such as Anísio Teixeira, Lúcia Casasanto, Alda Lotes, Aya Alves, among others, went to the Teachers College at the University of Columbia. Anísio Teixeira was an exemplar case, but not exceptional. He had a degree of Masters of Arts in 1929. The relationship with the U.S. brings up other questions. Despite the role played by Beatrice Ensor in NEF, it is important to recall that in 1932, at the Nice Conference, John Dewey took one of the vice presidencies, representing the U.S. The Progressive Education Association became an American section of NEF at the same time. While Ensor was unknown in Brazil, Dewey was considered one of the key personalities of new education in Brazil. It's worth to emphasize that the prestige of John Dewey was not the same in England. According to Darling and Nisbet, despite the efforts of Findlay to disseminate Dewey's ideas in UK, only in 1960s they penetrate in British soil. Darling and Nisbet argued that it was due to difference between Dewey and British social thought. The pages of the New Era reveal the same. There are few references to John Dewey. These vestiges seem to conduct the research to inquire about the constitution of epistemological territories in different geographical spaces and societies, yet to argue about the dispute of meaning associated to the New Education International movement concerned to expressions, about dispute of meaning associated to New Education movement concerned to expressions, progressive education, new education, active school, to institutional leadership, Teachers College, Institute Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Institute of Education London, to authors of reference and to attributes of new education. If we add Waters' argument about the coincidence of the rise of NEF and the creation of departments of education in universities, the problematic grows in interest. What is in this spot is the international circulation of ideas and individuals, as well as the local synthesis, the appropriations, and the hybridizations. In either case, there is a perfect harmony. On the contrary, the disputes also reveal a struggle inside the field to establish hierarchies. It is fascinating to follow the changes of configurations in the kaleidoscope of images of new education. And maybe these disputes can explain why, despite the UK gave birth to NEF and Brazil was attached to Lyon, the IOE and the British educators had never been a great influence to the Brazilian movement of new education. Thank you.